Welcome to Roots of Faith Ancestry. I'm Renee Richard, and I'm here with Judy Riffle and Leonard Smith III. And today's show will focus on African American genealogy and slave research. And over the past few weeks, we've been giving you a framework to work with on collecting your data and getting it organized, finding records, and documenting all the information that you did find in the records. But as we've stated in previous shows, also, all of the records, I'm going to say it again, all the records that we're looking at were never intended for a genealogist. So again, with African American genealogy and the changes that have occurred in history between 1860 and 1870, because we've talked about census records, vital records, but history changed. So we have to look at a different set of records now to go back for them. And we also have to look at a different methodology or a different way to find those records and to approach those records. So today's show will focus on that. And in order to learn more about it, really, we need to showcase some books that are very important too, because if you can read more on it and look at some online websites that Leonard's going to talk about, it will really help. So Leonard, I'll let you tell us about some of that.
Okay. I have found many books on African American research, and some I've actually found to be very helpful. Others I've found to be kind of generic. But one that I think we all agree on was one that I actually found at a book sale, Finding a Place Called Home, by Dr. D. Palmer Woodtor. And I know she's deceased now, but I have found this to be one of the best books I've actually have worked with or read concerning African American history. What she starts out with is actually her own family tree and actually branches into the different records and the styles and the techniques that she used to actually find her research. And I've actually used a lot of her methods in what I do and kind of tweak them as we all do. Websites, I have actually used a few websites that I found to be very helpful. I know there's others out there, but the ones that I use are called the root.com. There's Family Search. I love a lot of the Family Search sites because they give a lot of good aids that helps, and of course it's a free site. So there's a familysearch.org / African American genealogy. That's a very good site. Archives.gov, the government site, which has a section just for African American research called archives.gov / research / African Americans. And of course, I have my own site that I actually give a lot of tidbits that I've used in my research, and that's genealogystorytelling.com.
Good. And Judy, you have also some.
Well, Renee, you have a book there that's a very good beginner's reference on Black roots by Tony Burrows.
Right, a beginner's guide.
And it's a beginner's guide, and it's a very good place to start if you're beginning. And I've brought a few books, too, that are not quite beginner's books. They're a little bit more advanced, a little bit more academic. But I think it's important, because this is such a difficult subject, to read these books and understand some of the laws that pertain to Louisiana and slavery. And a couple of them that I have here by Judith Kelleher Schaefer are Slavery, the Civil Law, and the Supreme Court of Louisiana. She uses a lot of case studies from the state Supreme Court files. And also Becoming Free, Remaining Free, Manumission and Enslavement in New Orleans, 1846 to 1862. And Louisiana had such a large free people of color population. I think that this is important to read and to understand, because you may find some free people of color in your own ancestry. Another one on free people of color is Bounded Lives, Bounded Places, Free Black Society in Colonial New Orleans by Kimberly S. Hanger. And the last one I brought along is Africans in Colonial Louisiana, the Development of Afro-Creole Culture in the 18th Century by Gwendolyn Midlow Hall. And this is a companion piece to a website that she has that is important in finding some of the early slaves transactions in Louisiana.
Actually, I've used that database a lot in my research, and it's a great resource.
It's called Afro-Louisiana History and Genealogy. That's the website that a lot of people use.
And in that case, too, with hers, it goes back even earlier. You know, there's that gap with some of these others between 1860, because her book centers on even the colonial period.
The early period, up to 1820. Her database goes up to 1820.
Yeah, but it's an excellent website. I think all three of us have used it, and I think all three of us have used that book you have. I own it, but I have the paperback version. But anyway, all right, we're going to go to break, and when we come back from break, we'll actually look at a case.
I'm Bishop Robert Munch, Bishop of the Diocese of Baton Rouge. Through Catholic Charities, the Bishop's annual appeal not only assists people with some of the most pressing needs within our community, but also helps prepare them for a better future.
If you're considering $1, give 10. Your money goes to direct services. It's not part of an administrative overhead. It really is touching people's lives across all 12 parishes within the diocese. To whom much is given, much will be expected. And so to those of us who can give, dig deep, because the money will go far into helping others.
Please take some time to recognize the many blessings that God has given you and to express your gratitude to God for those blessings.
For more information, please call 225-336-8790 or visit baabr.org.
Welcome back. Right now we're going to have Leonard Smith is going to give us a case study of your family, correct? Someone in your family?
Yes, actually, because of my engineering background, I actually created a flow chart to kind of see where I had actually been on my research, when did I start, and where am I at now. And so you don't realize how much time and effort you put into research until you actually put it on paper. Let me also mention, I didn't mention in the previous, that I actually have a little book, a little beginner's guide that I actually wrote. And it's not a detailed, like a lot of the other books, but it gives a lot of little tidbit information. So it's a beginner's guide to searching family history. And a lot of the information that I'm about to talk about is where I got this information. I actually put it in this book. So I actually have a visual research flowchart of what I had done in my research. And as I mentioned before, my research started back in '76, believe it or not, when the Roots book came out by Alex Haley. And I read the book, 700 plus pages, I think it was. And in '77, the miniseries came out. So I thought, wow, that's a great idea to actually take the book and then make it into a miniseries. And of course, it took a course of I don't know how many days to actually show. So in '78, and again, this is the same family that I'm working with, I decided to interview my maternal grandmother. I actually found out information about her, but actually I was looking more for my maternal grandfather because I didn't know much about his family. And so I started out oral history, talking to my grandmother, and from there I actually went into the census records. And back then, of course, I didn't know that you work your way backwards, as we now know as genealogists. So I actually just started working in any census I could find. So in 1978, I went to the New Orleans Public Library and looked up the 1880 census and actually found my second great-grandmother and my maternal great-grandfather. So I got some names to work with. Now, this was the day of the sound decks and microfilm. And so what we can do now online is not as easily accessible back then. So it took me well over a day and a half to actually find this record because the library was crowded that day and you can only be on the machine a half an hour at a time. So I would get on and get off and someone else would come back on. So with that, I found this record. I was so excited, passed it on to my mother at the time, my grandmother, and all of her siblings, and everybody was excited about this information. And I just sat it on the side because actually it was working on my dad's tree, so I left this alone. So I didn't pick this back up until 2000, which we had a family reunion for this side of the family, the Bozeman side of the family. And that was the year I actually started online research. You know, family search had just come out. Ancestry had just come out. So I actually used those websites. And just so you know, my research at that time was 80% paper and 20% digital, okay? Because I did have some things online, but just only 20% of it. So after the family reunion, we had a good turnout, and I decided I needed to find out more about this family, this side of the family. So did research online, found more census records, because that's all I was looking for at the time. Then in 2002, we had a second family reunion, But it was a bad year for genealogy because I lost actually 2 uncles and my mother that year. So to say the least, I did not do a lot of research at all. So I kind of put it on the side. And again, this is the same family unit I'm looking for, and I want you all to know that, you know, over time, sometimes you have to put things on the side and then you regroup and come back. So you have to be persistent and consistent with this. 2005 came, we had a third family reunion, and of course 2005 in New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina. So I lost all of what I had before as far as research, everything that I had collected, the census records, the oral history which I had recorded, I lost all of that. So it took me a little while to get back into genealogy. So it wasn't until 2009 that I actually got back into this family tree. And then I found my ancestors in the 1870 and 1860 census. And of course, when we talk about looking for enslaved relative, one of the important census is that 1870 census because that is the first time they're mentioned by full name. I also found Louise, which is my third great-grandmother. She was in the 1860 census, and she was a free woman of color. So I had to find out how did that happen. And so I went back into the research. I went to the state archives and actually found more records. I also went to the state courthouse and actually found the parish courthouse, just to say, which was at that Iberville Parish and also Assumption Parish. And then I found a last will and testament with her name on it. And that opened up the doors to a lot of my research. And by this time, because of Katrina, my research had gone from 20% paper, digital, now it's now 80% digital and 20% paper. And so I actually have continued that trend, and I like to have paper, but I always have more in digital, and we'll talk about that later. In 2009, I also found records, church records. I used the Baton Rouge, Diocese of Baton Rouge, the Red Book, and actually that's when I met Renee. She translated, some of the records were in French, so she actually translated a few of them for me, and the will that I found, the first will actually was in French, so she translated that for me. From that, I was able to find a burial record for my second great-grandfather, a baptismal record for my great-grandmother, grandfather, and other new discoveries I found was names of a third great-grandfather. Fourth family reunion in 2010 found a second will and a will and testament. I also found some emancipation records of a third and second great-grandmother. I found succession papers, which this was like finding gold. I mean, the courthouse to me and the church records was the key to all of my research. 2011 went back to the courthouse and the church records. I stayed in those two. Did find some land that was purchased. I actually found the purchase records for Louise, my third great-grandmother, and she was purchased at age 12, 13, and I actually found another will. So back to the courthouse, back to the church records. I found actually Louise in a inventory record. So I've actually covered oral history, census record, church records, baptism, marriage, and burial, which are all vital records, succession papers, last will and testaments, land records, inventory records, and civil suit. So my research has covered the whole gamut as far as records are concerned, but it has actually gave me a good foundation on how to find other relatives who may have been enslaved down through the years. And that's it.
But in the case of this too, you're going to publish this as a book as well, correct?
That's right.
So in the future, you're going to need to be watching for Leonard's book on this family. So that's why he's not giving you a lot of names. I know his secrets because I've been there helping him. But as he said, this is a great example of where you're seeing all the things that we have been talking about over the last, few weeks put together in doing it. But the key was to break. You had some barriers to break,
yes.
And that's what the show is all about. It's very important. In this case, to read some books, learned what's involved with jumping, making that transition, that gap. So that's one of the things. So we're going to go to a little break, and when we return, we're going to show you some tips on how to get through that break.
Do you need a little light in your life? tune in to the next episode of Beacons of Light, where we'll share the story of the Society of St. Vincent de Paul in action, serving God's poor and homeless. We'll share stories of our volunteers and our supporters, making the gospel come to life for those in need.
God's way is my way, God's shield is around.
Hello everyone, I'm Shannon Acord and this is Colette Keith, and we're talking about Veritas Vitae, a brand new show that's going to talk about the sacredness of God's gift of life from conception to natural death and every stage in between.
We'll be discussing human trafficking to abortion to hunger. So tune in every week to see these episodes and learn how we're all connected by these issues and learn about the power of God's truth.
Watch our programming on demand anytime at CatholicLifeTV.org.
I'm Eddie Wright from St. Jean-Vianney Parish in Baton Rouge, and you're watching Catholic Life Television.
Welcome back to the show. Judy Ripple is going to present us now with some other sources of records for doing African-American enslaved genealogy.
Thank you, Renee. The first one I'd like to talk about are the Civil War pension records. During the Civil War, many African Americans joined the Union Army, and later on they or their widows applied for pensions. And these records are located at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. They can provide you with a lot of details about slavery and who the slave owners might have been. And I have an example here from one that is the deposition in this case. This is the case of Marie Louise, widow of John Broussard. And in her deposition, she says that her husband was born at Fosse Point and was the chattel in slavery of Eloi Broussard. Her name as a girl was Marie Louise Michel, and she was also the chattel of Eloi Broussard and born at Fosse Point. She goes on to say that she and her late husband grew up together on the same plantation and continued to live there after the war until 1872. So you've got some really good information that helps you bridge that gap, as you said, getting into slavery and who their owners might have been. And some of these pensions can be very voluminous and hundreds of pages, and you would write off to the National Archives to get a copy of it. Now, the second set of records I'd like to talk about are the Freedmen's Bureau records. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau was created after the Civil War. It was to assist the former slaves in their transition to freedom. They left an abundance of records that we can now access and use for genealogy. As you say, that's not why they were created, but that's what we use them for now. And I have an example of one of the many kinds of records that they created. This is a register of workers, and this is just one page. This goes on for many hundreds of pages. But this record of workers gives the former residence of the person and also their former owner. So this is another good source for bridging that gap. There are other kinds of records in the Freedmen's Bureau, really too voluminous to list. I've got an example here of an agreement with freedmen on a plantation in Iberville Parish. And there's a list of employees who worked for the plantation after slavery. And this one is 1866. So this isn't necessarily the plantation that they had been enslaved on, but it's possible that they were in that area because this is so a short a time after the Civil War. They were probably in that area, and it would be a very good clue. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau records are available through the National Archives on microfilm. Some of them, they've been put online. I believe we'll have a website that you can access some of those microfilm online. Also, the Freedmen's Bureau website has indexes to some of these records. Now, for the most part, very few of these records have been indexed. So it's a really slow process, and it is advanced genealogy to have to go through and search these records. But it can be well worth the time. And the third collection I wanted to talk about are plantation collections. Now, once you get into a plantation that you know your ancestor was on, you might want to check into manuscripts at libraries and archives. LSU has a very large collection of plantation records for Louisiana and surrounding area. Some of these are on microfilm that you can get through rental through the Family History Library in Salt Lake City through Family Search, or you can go to LSU and look on the microfilm there. I have an example of a diary that is one of the types of records you can find in the plantation records. Diaries, plantation owners kept diaries, and they would have registers of births and deaths of slaves. So you would want to check some of these records to see if your ancestors might have been mentioned. I found, for my clients, I found quite a few of their ancestors listed in these records, so it's well worth the time. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Judy. And lastly, I'm going to finish up with the Catholic records that Leonard talked about when he and I met back in 2009. On a previous show, we discussed researching, doing your genealogy using the quote-unquote red books, or the books published by the Diocese of Baton Rouge. We have, I can't even begin to tell you how many sacramental registers of slave entries that are not published. We're in the process of doing that, and that's one of the projects that I work on. So far, we've published 2 books of persons without surnames or slaves. And what we've done is we've had to do them differently. They're done demographically. So the first book started out with the civil parish of Point Capee, because again, different methodology when you're looking at slave research. We have to look at the fact that these people may have owned several pieces of property in different church parishes. So we're going to take the records for the entire civil parish and hopefully be able to put them in groups. Again, the books, the one thing that helps is that in parentheses will be the parents. In most cases with slaves, it will be the mother only. However, there are some that list both. So you always want to look for the mother when you're researching, or she will be listed that way. What we've done is broken it into categories so that you will start with a listing in the beginning that has individual names only. Because that way, if you know your grandmother or your great-grandmother was Adelaide, you would look for every Adelaide, and then by process of elimination, when the dates don't match, or the age doesn't match, or her death date doesn't match, you will hopefully get down to 1 or 2 or fewer. And then what it does is give who the slave owners are. If you know where they lived, or you know who may have owned them, or whose property they lived on, because after the Civil War in the 1870s, they may not have a name, but they may be living on the piece of property. You now have a clue to go to the courthouse. If you have not already done that, it goes both ways. Thus, the second part of the book lists all of the owners in alphabetical order with their slaves grouped underneath it. So if I look at DeQueer, it might be 4 or 5 different men or women that owned the slaves, but all of them are listed underneath them, so that now you know who Adelaide is. You may find children born to Adelaide, because again, this spans 1770 or earlier in the case of Point Capee, 1770 to 1900. We had an earlier book, that's why. One of the red books has the colonial slaves. But you can find children born to Adelaide. By doing this now, you've gotten that family group sheet put together. So you have to use these books in a different way that we use the red books, but again, mother will be in parentheses. And so that's just a very, very basic, and hopefully I haven't confused you for doing that. The second book that we published covered East and West Baton Rouge and the Felicianas, because again, that was, I should say, British territory in the colonial times, but your landowners are back and forth across the river, both sides of the river, in that geographic area, we hope. And we're now in the process of publishing the St. James records. And so hopefully we will get these out, but we still have a long way to go. So if we have not published your book, this is a case where you may want to call and make an appointment to come by the archives, and someone can help you with them. So covering the Diocese of Baton Rouge records, I want to talk real briefly on surnames and how they acquired surnames or didn't. One big misconception is that slaves did not have surnames. That is not true. We do see slaves with surnames. So oftentimes there's all kinds of circumstances. Some that I have seen might be their profession. Some we can't explain, such as Green, Tom Green. But for instance, I came across, I think it was John Black, and he was a blacksmith on the plantation. So that could be why he has that name. I found another one, I think he was Bill Cooper, and he may have been a Cooper. A Cooper in that time frame would have been the cistern maker or a barrel maker. So these are examples where profession may have indicated it. Now, after slavery, they still could, they might be mason if they were a brick mason. So that's one thing that we see. The other thing is that there is no set pattern for how slaves pick their names. We do know that they changed their names sometimes in those 20 years of Reconstruction after slavery until there was something they were comfortable with. A misconception is they took the owner's name. Not so. If you have 4 or 5 families on a plantation, there's no self-identity in everybody having the same last name. So they may have several things, and y'all can chime in. We see them taking their father's first name. Oftentimes, we see them taking their mother's first name in some cases. Famous people, Washington, President Washington, Jefferson, we see those names. They might take their father's name if they know who their father was. So they may have a different name from even their children who could have names. So there is no set pattern. This is what we have to find out doing the research. And this is what makes this so difficult. We could keep going on for hours on end on just this one subject. And hopefully we have tried to give you a starting point. And that's why we brought in the books and the websites, because there's no way that we could cover this. And it is a little more advanced than what we normally would do in the show. So hopefully you've gained something from this, and we've had fun trying to narrow it down.
Can I also interject a piece here is that in my research, I'm a Smith, which is always a great name to look for. I have Jefferson, I have Washington, I have Williams, and I have Jones. So I have all the most common names. So it's a challenge at times. And of course, when you pull up a list, there may be 20 or 30 Smiths in that with that same first name. But the surname, but you have to, like you said, narrow it down to that 1 or 2 or 3 that you can work with. And hopefully the dates will actually give you another clue to go to another paper trail.
That's it. So we will see y'all next week on Roots of Faith Ancestry.